August 1943, aboard the USS San Diego, somewhere in the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Commander James Russell, Chief Gunnery Officer, stood on the bridge, watching the radar screen with growing disbelief. 12 Japanese bombers were approaching in tight formation at 15,000 feet. Standard altitude, standard attack pattern, nothing unusual. Except for one thing. In the past 6 weeks, his gun crews had been achieving hit rates that defied every statistic he'd learned at Annapolis. Before July, shooting down an enemy aircraft with anti-aircraft fire required, on average, over 1-200 shells. The mathematics were brutal. You fired into the sky, calculated lead time, estimated altitude, and hoped for the best. Most shells exploded uselessly in empty air. A few came close enough to rattle an aircraft's frame or nick a wing. Actual direct hits, those that destroyed or critically damaged a plane, were rare, almost accidental. Gunnery was a game of volume and hope, not precision. But since his ship had been quietly equipped with the new fuses, those mysterious units that arrived in unmarked crates under strict security protocols, everything had changed. Now his crews were averaging 1 aircraft destroyed for every 200 shells. Some engagements were even better. Russell didn't understand how the new fuses worked. He'd been told they were classified, that questions were discouraged, that his job was simply to use them, not question them. But he understood results, and the results were impossible. As the Japanese formation drew closer, he gave the order. Commence firing. New ammunition only. The 5-inch guns of the San Diego roared to life. Russell raised his binoculars and watched the first salvo climb into the blue Pacific sky. And then, at exactly the right altitude, at precisely the right distance from the enemy aircraft, the shells exploded. Not randomly. Not scattered across the void in a futile cloud of shrapnel. But in precise, lethal air bursts, timed to detonate where the enemy planes were flying, not where they might be. The first bomber caught fire immediately, its wing engulfed in flame. The second began trailing thick black smoke, its engine crippled. The third broke formation, banking hard in a desperate evasive maneuver, but the next salvo anticipated the turn. More perfect air bursts. More hits. Within 3 minutes, 6 of the 12 bombers had been destroyed. The remaining 6 scattered, abandoning their attack run entirely. Russell lowered his binoculars, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from awe. In his entire naval career, he'd never seen anything like this. Anti-aircraft fire was supposed to be defensive, a deterrent, a way to disrupt enemy formations, and occasionally get lucky. This wasn't luck. This was execution. That evening, Russell attended a classified briefing with other gunnery officers from the task force. The room was tense, charged with a mixture of excitement and confusion. Every ship equipped with the new fuses was reporting identical results. Hit rates 5 to 6 times higher than with conventional time-fused or impact-fused ammunition. Enemy aircraft were being destroyed at rates that seemed statistically impossible. Admiral Harold Thompson, the task force commander, stood at the front of the room. "Gentlemen," he began, "I know you have questions about the new ordnance. I'm authorized to tell you very little, but you deserve to understand what you're working with." He paused, choosing his words with care. "The fuses you've been issued contain miniature radio transmitters. They detect proximity to targets and detonate automatically at optimal range. No timing calculations required. No guesswork. The shell itself determines when to explode." The room erupted in murmurs. Russell raised his hand. "Sir, with respect, how is that even possible? A radio set would be destroyed by the firing forces. The acceleration alone, over 20,000 gs, would shatter any vacuum tube." The Admiral nodded slowly. "That was the problem our scientists solved. They've created vacuum tubes that survive artillery launch. They've miniaturized radio equipment to fit inside a shell casing, and they've done it in such a way that mass production is possible." Another officer spoke up. "Sir, if we can do this, can the Japanese?" Admiral Thompson's answer was flat, final. No intelligence assessment suggests they're years away from anything comparable, possibly a decade. The manufacturing requirements alone are beyond their current capacity. Russell absorbed this. If true, it meant America had developed a weapons system the enemy could not counter, could not replicate, and might not even understand, a fundamental, asymmetric technological advantage. Thompson continued, "Your hit rates will improve as crews gain experience. But understand this, what you're witnessing is classified at the highest levels. The enemy must not learn how these fuses work. That's why they're currently restricted to maritime use only. If a dud lands on enemy soil, they could examine it, reverse engineer it, and close the gap." When someone asked what would happen if a ship carrying this ammunition was sunk, Thompson replied, "Recovery procedures are in place. But that's not your concern. Your concern is using these fuses to maximum effect while maintaining absolute secrecy." Russell left the briefing with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear: the war in the Pacific had fundamentally changed, and the Japanese didn't know it yet. Over 1,000 miles away, at the Japanese Naval Air Base in Rabaul, Lieutenant Tishiro Yamamoto sat in a debriefing room, his flight suit still soaked with sweat. He had just returned from his third mission against American task forces in the Solomon Islands. His squadron had launched with 18 aircraft. Only 6 remained operational. The losses weren't surprising. Combat was always dangerous, but the manner of the losses was deeply troubling. "Describe the American anti-aircraft fire," the intelligence officer prompted. Yamamoto struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like delusion. "It's different than before. The shells explode at exactly the right altitude, not too high, not too low. Right where we're flying. You're saying their gun crews have improved their calculations?" "No, sir. It's not about calculations. The shells seem to know where we are. They follow us. If we climb, they explode higher. If we dive, they explode lower." The intelligence officer made notes, his expression skeptical. "Lieutenant, combat stress can create perceptions that—" "I'm not imagining this," Yamamoto interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration. "Every pilot who's returned reports the same thing. The Americans have a new weapon, something that makes their anti-aircraft fire far more accurate than before." The officer closed his notebook. "We'll include your observations in the report. But without physical evidence, we can only speculate." Yamamoto knew his report would be dismissed, just like the others. The idea that America had developed some revolutionary technology seemed impossible to the high command. Japan had the better pilots, the superior tactics, the unbreakable warrior spirit that soft Americans lacked. Technology was supposed to be Japan's domain, not America's. But Yamamoto had seen friends die, not from near misses, but from precise, devastating explosions that tracked their every maneuver. Something had changed. And whatever it was, Japan had no counter for it. Over the following months, Japanese air operations in the Pacific deteriorated rapidly. Raid after raid ran into the new American defensive fire. Hit rates that had been acceptable, even favorable, suddenly became catastrophic. A bombing mission that would previously lose 2 or 3 aircraft now lost 8 or 10. Attack runs that crews had survived multiple times became death sentences. The Americans had turned the sky into a killing field. By October 1943, Japanese naval aviation had lost over 400 aircraft to American anti-aircraft fire in the Solomon Islands theater alone. The rate of attrition was unsustainable. Pilot training couldn't keep pace with losses. Aircraft production couldn't match destruction rates. And most troubling of all, Japanese commanders couldn't explain why. Some attributed it to improved American training. Others suggested better radar direction. A few mentioned rumors of a new type of shell, but without evidence, such speculation was dismissed as the ravings of traumatized pilots. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most experienced naval aviation officers, reviewed the loss reports with growing alarm. The numbers told a story that tactical explanations couldn't account for. American defensive capabilities had increased by a factor that seemed mathematically impossible through training or tactics alone. "We're missing something," he told his staff. "The Americans have changed something fundamental about their anti-aircraft systems. We need to determine what." But determination required information, and information required either captured equipment or detailed observation. The Americans were careful. No unexploded shells with the new fuses were recovered from land battles because the fuses weren't being used over land, only at sea, where recovery by the enemy was impossible. The secrecy was absolute. And so Japanese pilots continued to fly into increasingly lethal skies, confused and unprepared for a weapon they didn't understand and couldn't defend against. What neither Russell nor Yamamoto fully grasped was that they were witnessing a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. The VT proximity fuse, deployed exclusively in anti-aircraft roles throughout 1943 and early 1944, was systematically destroying Japanese naval aviation's offensive capability. The Americans weren't just shooting down more planes. They were changing the strategic calculus of air-sea warfare. Japanese doctrine relied heavily on mass air attacks against American naval forces. This had worked at Pearl Harbor. It had worked in the early carrier battles. But it required achieving concentration of force, getting enough bombers and torpedo planes through defensive fire to inflict significant damage. The math was simple but brutal. If a raid of 50 aircraft could expect to lose 10 planes to defensive fire, that was acceptable. 40 aircraft reaching their targets could sink a carrier or a battleship. But if that same raid now lost 30 planes to defensive fire, the equation collapsed. 20 aircraft reaching their targets might damage a ship, but probably couldn't sink it. And the loss ratio, **60% casualties**, was strategically catastrophic. No air force could sustain such losses. Japanese commanders didn't have the data to understand this shift. They saw increased losses but attributed them to various factors: better American pilots, more ships with more guns, improved training, bad luck. They didn't realize they were fighting a technological revolution. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, reviewed casualty reports in his flagship's cabin. The numbers troubled him deeply. Japan had started the war with approximately 3,500 trained naval aviators. By late 1943, fewer than 1,000 remained. Training replacements took 18 months. Losing experienced pilots at the current rate meant that within a year, Japanese naval aviation would be manned primarily by inexperienced crews, and inexperienced crews had even lower survival rates. "We cannot continue these operations," he told his staff. "The attrition is unsustainable. Sir, if we cease offensive operations, the Americans will advance unopposed." His chief of staff replied, "If we continue offensive operations at current loss rates, we'll have no aircraft left to defend with." Yamamoto countered, "The Americans have changed something. I don't know what, but our previous assumptions about acceptable loss rates no longer apply." Throughout 1943 and into early 1944, the VT fuse remained one of the war's best-kept secrets. Japanese intelligence never captured an intact example. They never determined the exact mechanism. They knew American anti-aircraft fire had become dramatically more effective, but they couldn't explain why. Some Japanese scientists theorized about radio detonation. The concept wasn't unknown. German researchers had explored similar ideas before the war, but theory and implementation were vastly different things. Creating a miniature radio system that could survive artillery launch, function reliably, and be mass-produced required solving dozens of engineering problems simultaneously: ruggedized vacuum tubes, shock-resistant circuitry, miniaturized antennas, and precision manufacturing at scale. Even if Japanese scientists understood the principle, they lacked the industrial capacity to implement it. Japan's electronics industry was tiny compared to America's. Vacuum tube production was limited. Precision manufacturing at scale was impossible with the resources available. Even if they'd captured a complete fuse and reverse engineered it perfectly, they couldn't have built them in meaningful numbers. And that was the fundamental truth that neither side fully articulated during 1943. America wasn't just winning through better tactics or more resources. America was operating at a different level of technological sophistication. The VT fuse was just one example, but it was representative of a larger pattern: better radar, better fire control computers, better communications, better everything. And crucially, all of it produced in vast quantities. By the time the war ended, American factories had produced over 22 million VT fuses. Of those, approximately 5 million were used in anti-aircraft roles in the Pacific. The Japanese, meanwhile, never produced anything comparable, not a prototype, not a failed attempt, not even a serious development program. The gap was absolute. August 1945, after Japan's surrender, Commander Yamamoto sat in an interrogation room facing American technical intelligence officers. The war was over. Secrecy no longer mattered. The Americans were surprisingly forthcoming. "We notice your aircraft losses increased dramatically in mid-1943," an American officer said. "Did your forces determine why?" Yamamoto shook his head. "We knew your anti-aircraft fire became more effective. We didn't know how." The officer pulled out a VT fuse and set it on the table between them. "This is what killed so many of your pilots. It's a proximity fuse. Contains a miniature radio transmitter and receiver. Detects when it's near an aircraft, and detonates automatically." Yamamoto picked up the fuse, turning it over in his hands. It was smaller than he'd expected. Unremarkable looking, just a brass cylinder with a few wires and a tiny glass tube inside. "How many of these did you produce?" "Over 22 million. The number was incomprehensible. Yamamoto set the fuse down carefully. "We never had a chance, did we? Not against this. Not against an industrial system that could mass-produce something this sophisticated." "No," the American officer said quietly. "You didn't. The outcome was determined before the war even started. We just had to prove it through combat." Yamamoto thought about all the pilots he'd known, all the skilled aviators who'd died in combat. They'd fought bravely. They'd executed their missions professionally. They'd done everything their training and doctrine required. And they'd been slaughtered by a weapon they never understood, produced in quantities they couldn't match, by an enemy whose industrial capacity they'd fatally underestimated. "When did you first deploy these?" Yamamoto asked. "Mid-1943, exclusively in anti-aircraft roles. And you kept it secret for 2 years. We couldn't risk you capturing one and learning how it worked. Once we deployed them in ground combat in December 1944, the secret was out. But by then, the war's outcome was already certain." Yamamoto nodded slowly. "If we'd known, if our leadership had understood what they were facing, would it have changed anything?" The American officer considered the question. "Probably not. Even if you'd known, you couldn't have built these. Your electronics industry couldn't match ours. Your manufacturing couldn't match ours. Knowing about a weapon and being able to counter it are different things." The story of the VT fuse in the Pacific is often overshadowed by more dramatic narratives: the island campaigns, the carrier battles, the atomic bombs. But in many ways, it's more significant, because it represents something more fundamental than any single battle or weapon. It represents the industrial and technological gap that made Japan's defeat inevitable from the start. Japanese pilots in 1943 were flying into a new kind of warfare, one where their skill and courage were irrelevant against an enemy with systematic technological advantage. They couldn't train their way out of it. They couldn't fight harder or develop better tactics. The shells exploding around them represented an industrial capacity and scientific sophistication they couldn't match. Every proximity fuse was a demonstration of American manufacturing capability. Every successful air burst was proof of a research and development system operating at a level Japan couldn't approach. And there were millions of them, millions of small, unremarkable-looking devices, each one a miniature marvel of engineering, each one mass-produced with precision that Japanese industry couldn't replicate. Lieutenant Commander Russell, watching from the deck of the USS San Diego, saw hit rates that defied his training. Commander Yamamoto, flying through the killing skies, saw friends die with impossible accuracy. Neither understood the full scope of what they were witnessing. They were watching the future of warfare, a future where industrial capacity and technological sophistication determined outcomes more than courage or tactics. A future where the ability to mass-produce complex electronics was as important as the ability to field armies. The proximity fuse didn't win the Pacific War alone, but it killed thousands of Japanese aircrew. It forced Japan to abandon offensive air operations. It demonstrated an industrial advantage so vast that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome it. And perhaps most significantly, it did all this while remaining almost completely secret from the enemy. The Japanese lost the war fighting weapons they understood, but they were also dying to weapons they never even knew existed. That invisibility, that complete asymmetry of knowledge and capability, was perhaps the most telling aspect of all. When the war ended and the fuses were finally revealed, Japanese officers responded with a mixture of shock and resignation. Shock at the sophistication. Resignation because understanding the weapon made clear just how outmatched they'd been. The mathematics were inescapable. America had produced 22 million units of a weapon Japan couldn't have built even one of. That ratio told the entire story of the Pacific War more clearly than any battle report ever could. In the end, the VT proximity fuse stands as evidence of a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Technology and industrial capacity matter more than courage. Production capability determines outcomes more than tactical skill. Wars are won not just on battlefields, but in factories, laboratories, and research facilities. The Japanese pilots who died in 1943 never knew what killed them. They never understood that they were fighting not just American sailors and pilots, but an entire industrial system operating at a scale and sophistication their nation couldn't match. That ignorance was itself part of their defeat, a defeat written in the sky by shells that knew exactly when to explode.